from there, Elisha went up to Bethel. As he was walking along the road, some youths came out of the town and jeered at him. "Go on up, you bald head," they said. "Go on up, you bald head." And he turned around, looked at them, and called down a curse on them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the youths. 42 of the youths. And then it finishes off. And he went to Mount Carmel, and from there he returned to Samaria. End of story. And I'm going like, oh my God, talk about power literally going to your head. These little kids are calling him Baldy. And then, all these bears come out and kill 42 kids. And it just seemed like retribution without any sort of reprimand from God even, because I don't see that, God said, hey, that really was not a nice thing that you did. So I'm really having trouble with that passage, because Elisha is a prophet and a representative of God, and based on Christ's example, it doesn't feel like he was doing this in a godly way. Maybe self-righteous were pissed off that, they didn't like his hairstyle. Anyway, so if you could just comment.
Who has the least hair among us?
Kevin's been meditating on this passage, Rob, so Kevin's going to go for it first.
I'm the youngest, but I am involved. Bethel's like 45 minutes from here, so if you're thinking about calling out at some bald people up there, you just want to take it easy. It's a very tough passage for a lot of reasons, but let's think about a few possible considerations for it. Number one is God determines the duration of everyone's death, or the timing of everyone's death. If you adhere to the worldview that God exists. If you adhere to the worldview that God does not exist, and that life, as Mr. Dawkins believes, is the emergence of what Bertrand Russell calls the random collocution of atoms. We've randomly emerged, and we can randomly disappear, whether that's by the mauling of bears, which, if God does not exist, was merely a mauling of bears, or in case a sinkhole opens up where you happen to be standing on the beach. But I don't believe that life is just a random emergence from nothingness. I believe that life is the design of God. When I die, God will determine when that is, in the instance of an old man dying or a child dying. So number one is God has control over when everyone dies. Number two is recording of history is not the same as the blessing of the events of history. The Bible records that David, who's a man after God's own heart and a hero of the Old Testament, arranged to have Uriah killed. The recording of that in the Bible is not the same as God saying, that was great and I bless it. So too, perhaps Elisha had some supernatural powers that he used against these kids. That doesn't necessarily mean that God was okay with that. Third thing I would say is, the word for children that appears in 2 Kings appears elsewhere in the Old Testament. I believe the word is Naam, but forgive me if my memory is not completely correct. Elsewhere, that same exact term is used for armies, for adults. So we've translated things into the English language, sometimes not with perfect accuracy. So it's possible that these are people where Elijah and Elisha have been before speaking out against the evil ways, if you will, up in Bethel, and God's justice sort of reemerged in this case. Last thing I would say is baldness may be attributable to the fact that he's in mourning for Elijah being taken up in the chariot. We see that in Job when he found out that his family died, he shaved his head. So they may very well have been doing more than just mocking a George Costanza lookalike, but actually saying, even in your mourning, we are mocking you. I think it's a very difficult passage, but those are some thoughts I offer you in response.
My only question is your middle response being David. It was very clear in Scripture that when David arranged for the death of Uriah, that David paid the price for that. In this example, it just seems like Elisha was wildly offended, killed a bunch of kids, and that was that.
I would just like to jump in this real quick. I've been thinking about this passage, and a couple things is it was believed in ancient Israel that, and there were very few people who were bald, and if indeed Elisha was bald, the belief that a good head of hair, if you will, was a sign of strength and a sign of virility in ancient Israel. So the thought being that they're mocking him as being weak and without power. And it's not a few kids. There's 42 that were mauled, but there may have been 100 kids there. I mean, this is a lot, right? And they're basically saying, you have no power. In effect, saying to God, God, you have no power, right? And all of a sudden, Elisha calls down this curse, and God's power is on display. Now, it brings me a challenging question in my heart, right? In a sense, this may have convinced those kids that God is real, God is powerful, and this is a God of justice. This may have actually been a good event for the kids there, because now they've seen God really act right in front of their very own eyes, which is fascinating. So it brings a really difficult question, a question that Jacob had, because Jacob wrestled with God and he walked away with a limp for the rest of his life. What would you be willing to give to see the power of God manifested in front of you, if that meant that you had to be maimed or had to walk with a limp for the rest of your life? And what God is saying is, it transformed Jacob's life, right? Because the greatest tragedy is not death. The greatest tragedy is a life apart from Christ. That's the greatest tragedy. And so, whether Jacob walking with a limp or these kids walking with a scar from a bear's claw,
So mauled does not mean killed. Mauled.
I don't know if mauled means killed. I have to look at it, but it didn't say killed. It uses mauled, so I need to look at that. But it may be that at the end of the day, this was God showing his power, and it may be that this was the best thing that could happen to them, because the greatest tragedy isn't being mauled by a bear. Perhaps.
Don't waste my time. Tell it to me straight. The truth is getting hard to find. I have objections to what I've learned. I have questions and concerns. Give me an answer.